The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees.
I'm Henry Prenger. I work for Lafarge Wholesome. I don't work for Maryland State Highway Administration anymore. It was a great thing to start off my career as an engineer working for a state highway. A lot of times we pick on those guys and we laugh about what's yellow in Sleep 6. It's a state highway van. You guys have heard that before. But there's some very sharp people that work for the DOTs and they want to do a good job and they want to put a good product out. So this is the Vienna Bypass Bridge. It's going over the Nanticoke River. And if you're in Maryland and you're driving to Ocean City, Maryland, which in the wintertime is a very small town, in the summertime it's the second biggest city in Maryland. So everybody's going to Ocean City. And this was the Vienna Bypass Bridge that was built. There were some issues with it when it was built. And around those issues there are some of the things I'm going to talk to you about. So it's kind of ancient history when you take a look at that guy there and look at this guy here. It's a little scary. If you're young, this can happen to you. Push away from the table and the bar, okay? Why do I want to talk about something that happened like a quarter of a century ago? A couple guys in the bar asked me that last night. This is old news. And I said, well, it's really not old news because I never told anybody about it. I worked for a research division in Maryland State Highway. And shortly after the project was done, the research division was closed. And we never wrote a report on it, and it was something that we knew internally and a couple other guys from a couple other states knew, but we never got it out to anybody else. And I always felt bad because it was pretty cool stuff that went on, and I think that people should have known about it. As I go through this, there's not one graph in this, which I think is unique for any ACI presentation, but it's good knowledge, I do believe. So this Vienna Bypass Bridge was built 25 years plus ago. And when it was built, it was a big deal project. Everybody was looking at it. And it turns out that there was a crack going across this bridge about every 3 feet. Every step you made, you stepped on a crack. Transverse and big longitudinal one down the middle. Is this a design issue? Is it just with this bridge? What went on? And about this time was when I was starting with the state. And I was working in construction. Maryland State Highway made you work in construction for 1 year, which I do believe for any engineer starting off, you should have to work in construction. We all sit here and we write specifications all day long. A lot of people that are writing them have never seen concrete in the real world. So know very good theoretically and way over my head theoretically, but that background knowledge is really, really great. So I'm a young engineer and I'm very nervous about starting off, and I work a year in construction and I have a background in construction. My father was a contractor, so I was very comfortable there. But I was moving into research. How many engineers do we have out there? Oh, this is a good audience. So you guys will know when you get out of school, you're real like, what are they going to ask me the first day? And I've kind of forgotten a year, everything that I learned. So I had my textbooks in the car that I could run out and readily reference. Got to take a smoke, figure it out. But they didn't ask me that. They said, you got a little simple project that we want you to do. And the reason why we're going to let you do this project, because we don't let new guys do anything forever. But the guy that was going to do this, his mom got sick and he had to go back to India. So you're going to start the project off, but you're not going to do anything important in the project. And when the guy from India comes back, who was a really good engineer, Gopal Shah, he's going to take this over and he's just going to run with it. So do what we tell you to do. What they wanted me to do was to go out and look around the state to see were we having a problem with cracking in bridge decks. And we were. That was an easy one to do. The idea was that was just calling around project engineers. What have you seen? So the other thing was go out and do an investigation of this, right? This isn't all my thoughts. It was a brilliant engineer named Scott Parrish who ran the whole department, and he told me to do this. And my whole thing in this was the second one, measure and map out the crack patterns in the bridges. And then Gopal was going to come back and he was going to identify the type of cracks and look for correlations with design. Is it in negative moment areas and things like that? And look for correlations with mixed design. This was also a part of a new engineer, what he does. I was to crawl around in dusty old corridors and pull out stuff and look at mixed designs and correlate it with the good and the bad bridges. And then Gopal was going to come back, look at everything that I did, the scut work, and he'd put his mind together and say, this is what we should do. So this was my job. All my fears and all my textbooks, I didn't have to worry about it. I was out rolling this thing around bridge decks. And it was very interesting to me because I'd always been on the other side of it, stuck in traffic, and you roll up and the lane's closed and you can't figure out what the people are doing. People get really mad. They threw stuff at me, okay? I closed down one lane at 95 going over 695 in Baltimore, and I backed up traffic for 10 miles. People were livid, but the state said, you got to do it. This is important. So I did it, and I mapped all this good stuff out. Unfortunately, Gopal's mom was really sick. He stayed there for a long period of time. I got to be real friends with Scott. He was a real sharp guy. I pretended I knew a lot more than I did, and I told him I was going to grad school, and he was just like, well, maybe this guy has potential. And I'll groom him. I'll let him do a little bit more. So I came back and I said, Scott, number one, we have a cracking problem in the state, and 30% of our bridge decks, and it really was, to say how many feet apart, it was one step apart. Every step you took, you were stepping on a crack. And that was 30% of the bridges that we had. The other 70%, all in good shape. The cracks were drying shrinkage cracks. I was so new, I didn't know the difference between a plastic and a drying shrinkage crack. So I called, when you work for the state, you have this group of people that are really brilliant in all the other states, and you just start calling around. You're saying, well, this is what it looks like. And so they gave me the background, and I was convinced it was drying shrinkage. One of the things that got thrown at me was the cracks were happening early on. And by early on, like in one day, they were happening. So a lot of people are saying, well, that can't be drying shrinkage. That's still plastic shrinkage. But it didn't look like the typical plastic shrinkage cracks. And some of these waited for about a week to occur. So I was convinced it was a drying shrinkage crack, and I think I was right, and I proved myself. There was no correlation with the design. So Maryland at the time had switched over. The older bridge decks were mostly straight Portland cement concrete. Most of the newer bridge decks had slag cement in it. So a plant had opened up there on the East Coast. They put a lot of slag out. Everybody was using slag. One of the questions, could this be, we're putting slag in it and now we got a problem. When we looked at it, didn't matter if it was straight Portland or if it had 25% slag or if it had 50% slag, you had an equal chance of getting a crack in that bridge deck. So no correlation with the mixed designs or the components. So then I started calling around all the smart guys in my little network, which was growing because I was really new. I didn't want my boss to know how dumb I was, so I just called other people in other states because I didn't care. Do you guys know these two guys up here? Kind of famous around here, right? And if you sit on the curing committee, you know these guys know their stuff. And if you know them at all, you also know they're two of the nicest guys in the world. Because as a real young engineer that didn't know anything, they made me feel good, like I did. And I asked a lot of dumb questions, and they answered them the best that they could. It turns out Cecil was having the same problem down in North Carolina. So Cecil worked for North Carolina DOT at the time. He was the head of materials. And it's really funny that you got a young engineer calling up the head of materials, and he would sit there on the line with me for an hour. I'd be saying, it looks like this, Cecil, and they're telling me this, and they're, no, son, this is what it is, in a good old Southern accent I can't do. And then I would back a lot of this up with Chelik, right? So what Cecil told me is, I'm having a lot of cracking on my bridge decks. We're going to fogging. And the fogging seems like it's going to work. And I'm convinced what you're seeing is what I'm seeing. And this is drying shrinkage cracks, and this is where we all should go with fogging. Now, this is how long ago this all was. Nobody knew what fogging was. Now we're talking about fogging all the time, and nobody knew what it was. And this was my idea of fogging. It's like, okay, I guess I got a machine, and you hook it up, and you get this good fog going out over a bridge deck, and where do I buy it? And Cecil said, well, I don't know. We haven't figured that part out yet, but we know if we can raise the humidity over that bridge deck, we're going to keep it moist on it, and everything is going to be good. So we're both trying to find a fogger. I'm starting out, and they send me out to bridge decks to start looking at this, and I wrote a specification. And talking to Cecil, it was like, well, it needs to be an atomized spray. That's a good word, atomized spray. So we wrote it in the spec. It's going to be atomized, okay? I thought it was great. That's what I got. Now, we all write specifications in here, right? And sometimes you think in your head that they're going to understand what you want when you get out there. And I've realized doing this that you have to be real careful what you write down, because that guy could tell me that this was atomized and explain it to me backward and forward, so I would have to finally give up. So it didn't work real well. This is the nozzle that was used all the first year until I told them stop, enough. And the thing that they do with this, they give it to the dumbest guy out in construction. And I say that because I was, when I started out in construction working for my dad, the dumbest guy. And actually the dumbest guy has a flag and he waves people in, and they gave that to a more intelligent guy and gave the fogging to the flag guy. So the flag guy had his hose, and I said, well, at least put it on a fine spray and hold it up in the air. And everybody's making fun of him. And then the finisher's saying, give me a little water over here. And he's doing that kind of stuff. And I swear this happened like 4 or 5 bridge decks. He just let his hand go down because he was bored, and concrete was spitting up in the air and pieces of aggregate. So we have a real good bridge engineer in Maryland, Jock Friedman. I don't know if anybody knows Jock, but you should. He's been the head of bridge design probably 60 years in Maryland, and a very approachable guy. In the weird way that things happen, I had this small meeting to tell him how things were going. I wear a high school ring, which nobody does anymore, and it has personal reason, but I won't go into that. But it had personal reason for Jock too, because we went to the same engineering high school that's been around for about 150 years. And we started talking about that, and then he said, well, tell me, son, tell me about this curing. So I went into it, and I said, I'm struggling. And he goes, I said, I don't know how to write this spec. And I've talked to all these smart guys, and they don't know how to write this spec. So he said, write it this way. And this is the specification, fogging to be approved by Henry. That went out on all of our specifications, going out for all the bridge decks. It may be very popular in construction. Young engineer, you know how much they love young engineers in construction, right? And I'm going out and saying you can't use your hose anymore. You got to come up with something better. And this is kind of what I'm thinking of. So they tried. And this was probably the better thing that they had out there, and it wasn't great. But it's like a high pressure spray, and if you kept it high enough, it did actually kind of fog coming down. It wasn't great though. And you still had the problem with the guy that just got bored or tired and he was blowing concrete around. This was the other thing that we did, and this was to keep the guy from blowing concrete all around when he got tired. And this is kind of what they used to spray bug spray around. And this worked okay if it wasn't windy. If it was windy, not so good. The other problem is, when this happened, this movie had come out, The Rocketeer. So everybody in construction was talking to the dumbest guy there and yelling, hey, Rocketeer, ha, ha, ha. And he hated it. He absolutely hated it. He just tried to hide from the bridge. And the other one that was there was Ghostbuster, and they would sing the Ghostbuster song when the guy came along. It was not good. Beyond it not being good, mostly what I was doing is getting the cars wet around the bridges and not really getting the concrete moistened or the humidity raised or all the other cool things that I wanted to do. So I went back and talked to Jock, and I said, Jock, I don't know. I'm trying real hard. Everybody hates me. I had death threats several times. Construction is real interesting. I was told by one guy, do you know bad things happen in the middle of the night on bridge decks, and it's a long fall down there? And another guy got into a discussion with me and said that he wouldn't cure it because I was a Catholic and I wouldn't go to heaven. Very weird things happen, right? So I'm dealing with all of this, and Jock wants me to name names when I go back. And I'm like, nah, they hate me enough. I can't name names. So he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, look, we want it to stay wet. If they would just put the wet burlap down, that would be great. So he pulls all these construction guys in, and he goes, Henry wants you to put wet burlap down within a half hour. And they'll go, we can't do that. He's crazy, and we're going to mar the surface, and this is the worst thing that anybody ever came up with, and where did this engineer come from? And they're all screaming, and Jock said, okay, then you have to get 12 foggers. You get those guys out there on every corner and every spot of that bridge deck, or you can put wet burlap down. It's your choice. So, go back to my foggers. They said, we don't want to do that anymore. Put the foggers back on the flags. We're going to do your stupid wet burlap, and we're going to stick it in your face, and it's not going to work. You're still going to get cracks. This is crazy. So if you can see in the background, they've got the Bidwell machine going across. They're placing the concrete. They're already putting wet burlap down. And I had so many project engineers just say, you can't do that. If I hadn't kind of grown up in construction, and if I hadn't had a year of working in construction, they would have bulldozed me. I would have just said, okay, you're right. But I'm hard-headed, and I knew they could do it, and they did it. and it worked. They complained because there's footprints out there. And on almost every bridge deck in Maryland, there's a footprint, several of them. And the finishers kind of love it because it's their mark on the bridge deck. But you don't realize that you're driving over a footprint at 55 miles an hour. You can have a pretty deep footprint and you will not realize that you have it at 55 miles an hour. So we would set it up, the bid weld machine would go through the minimum amount of finishing that you could do on the concrete and the wet burlap right away. Hardly touch the concrete. And our cracking went away. The next year, this was a several-year project. I worked every bridge that they did. So if you guys are familiar with bridge pours, a bridge means you might have 12 pours on a single bridge, and they do them all at about 4 o'clock in the morning. I was really getting worn out with this, but I kept going out, and they actually did what they were supposed to do. The one guy that would not do this was a friend of mine, and probably would not because he was a friend of mine and he knew I would never tell on him. He said, I don't want to mar the surface with wet burlap, so I'm going to put dry burlap down and then wet it. And we had a huge argument. And he did it, and his bridge cracked. Every other bridge that we did not crack. Every other one. Statisticians in here, is that statistically significant? It was pretty cool, I thought. It came back budgetary cuts, and they closed research down. And it was really a shame because there were a lot of cool projects that we worked on. And a lot of things, if anybody here works in research, you realize like maybe 1 in 10 things that you ever do works out, but that 10 thing will pay for every other thing that you did. And this paid a lot for Maryland. I learned a lot. Even though I hated getting up every morning to go out on a bridge deck pour, it was like getting a master's degree in concrete because you get to see a whole bunch of people finish a whole bunch of different ways and the good things and the bad things. Curing is important in preventing drying shrinkage cracks. When I started this project, so many people told me this will not stop the drying shrinkage crack. The minute you pull the curing off, the crack will appear. It didn't. I went back out a year later, it did not. Writing a specification and enforcing a specification, they're two different animals. It really amuses me so much when people write something, and I still see it with the state and all my old friends there, and they're saying, we're going to say to do this. And I know if you don't go out and make it happen, it won't happen. And a whole lot of times you write something dumb and you don't even know it because you're not out there to see people aren't even doing it because it's so dumb. You need to get buy-in from inspectors and the contractors. And this is really interesting because I'm still dealing with this today. Everybody wants to do a good job. Everybody thinks that they know how to do a good job. You'll hear contractors, I've been doing this for 30 years and I know what I'm doing and you don't need to tell me. If you can come out and prove to them that this is the right way to do something, they will do it. They will change, but they need to know the whole background of what you're doing. A lot of times as engineers, and especially if you haven't been kicked around a whole lot as an engineer, if you write a spec and you come out and you tell them, there, this is what you need to do, the minute you leave, they're not going to do it. If you come out and say, hey, I want to work with you, got something new, I think it's going to work, and these are all the reasons why, they'll generally work with you. We need to do a whole lot better job, and this has gotten worse in my lifetime, of training inspectors and training contractors. We do a horrible job with that, and a lot of the inspectors that I run into now really do not know anything about concrete, and they do some very dangerous things to make a bad product for us. All right, ancillary lessons. I get to use that word. I actually looked it up to make sure I was using it right. It means secondary lessons. Other things that I learned from this were, because I'm working in an environment with a lot of concrete decks that had a lot of slag in them, and I'll hear people say slag causes scaling, and if you use 50% slag, you're going to get scaling. And you'll hear a lot of people around here that say it in meetings I'm in, they're saying we ought to specify this or that. I got to look at a whole huge amount of bridge decks that were placed with 50% slag that had no scaling. The only time I saw one bridge deck of all the ones that I looked at that scaled was placed in January. Why does that happen? Because on a bridge deck, you do very little bit of hand finishing. If you ever see scaling, it's always where the finisher was touching it. So that was a big thing that I learned. The other thing that I learned was coming out of that, a couple years later, I'm working in industry, and I get called up to New Hampshire to talk to them about a bridge deck cracking problem they have, and I thought I had all the answers. I said, well, you guys aren't curing right. You ought to do this and that. And they said, well, we're curing exactly how you're telling us already. We figured that out for ourselves, and we're still having the problem. Very interesting backside to that story. New Hampshire DOT, they do some really, really sharp stuff. And what they were doing was saying, we want some very high performance concrete, and we're going to throw out to you what we need. So we want real low permeability. And if you can give it to us, we're going to give you a bonus. So we're just a bunch of dumb ready-mix guys, and we're going, hey, all of a sudden we can figure out how to do permeability because that means money. We're not really dumb. We know how to do it if money's involved. Bring up the cement content. So permeability went down like ridiculous low numbers, below 500 coulombs, and they had cracks all over the place. And we all know you get low permeability and you have a crack, and day one you still have chlorides down where you don't want them to be. Those guys were a lot smarter than me, and they figured that out. So curing is important, but it's a holistic problem that you have to take a look at. I learned a whole lot more from that. It was an education that was probably better than my college education to go out there and look at all that stuff. This is what disturbs me right now, and this is like small potato stuff. It's a sidewalk. What's the guy doing? Anybody? Less than the concrete, right? Does anybody think this is a real big deal? Okay, yeah, there's a couple of us, right? In my area, like Delaware, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, probably over $20 million worth of sidewalks got ripped out in the last couple of years. Huge deal. You go around and you tell everybody, these are the things that are real important. You need to write them in the specification, which they did. You need to enforce it. You need to get inspectors out. You need to train everybody. You need to do everything. And I never saw an inspector out on a project all summer long. Everything that was in that specification was still being done wrong. Nobody was running air tests. Nobody was running slump tests. The lessons I got 25 years ago, if you want something to happen, you have to be out there and you need to kick some tail to make it happen. They're still there today. And to me, it's kind of a big deal. Just as a taxpayer, when I'm throwing $20 million out for somebody to rip a sidewalk off again, it ticks me off.
How long did you have your wet burlap wet?
7 days. That was another one that nobody liked.
And that's what 308.1 says,
Yeah. Cecil and I shared a lot of our information later on. We were talking a lot. Cecil is still one of my best friends. I just admire the man, and he throws knowledge my way, and I think he's my friend. So he's friendly with everybody. Anybody else? No. Once I figured out what worked, I didn't want to step back. Yeah. And it was one of the things, and this is a state perspective. My state highway hat is back on. If you require something and you make everybody do it, the cost is the same for everybody. So when they're bidding a project, they can bid it up a little bit. The cost of another couple of days of curing for a state highway for a bridge deck is nothing. Thank you very, very much.